things, exchange and so on, corruption and so on and so on, bad communists and so on, exploiters and so on and so on, just shoot and so on, trying to lynch them and so on. Vietnam, yes, and so on, Azerbaijan and so on, Africa and so on and so on, Singapore and so on, Argentina, Chile and so on, Chicago and so on, Romania, Hungary and so on, West Berlin and so on, Ukraine and so on and so on, racist cliches and so on, choice and so on, binary logic and so on, using it and so on and so on, marginalized and so on, correct rules and so on and so on, suffering and so on and so on, living beings and so on, who saw them the last time and so on, clown and so on and so on, dirty words and so on, scamming and so on, language and so on and so on. We are all fascinated and so on, ourselves and so on, nationalism and so on and so on, populism and so on, being anti-black and so on, anti-intellectualism and so on and so on, consummation and so on and so on, sexual, ethnic and so on, in city parks and so on, big public spectacle and so on, hundreds of billions of dollars and so on, controlled by the state and so on and so on. Your breast and so on and so on, ironically and so on, humor and so on, rights and so on and so on, socialist and so on, Wall Street and so on, the model of tolerance and so on, who is guilty and so on, segregation, toilets and so on and so on, total support and so on, Holocaust deniers and so on, women and so on, political correctness and so on, being more democratic and so on, solidarity and so on, thousands of people on the streets and so on and so on, marry and so on, to be or not to be and so on and so on, tragedy, people are dying and so on, I laugh and so on, explicitly orders and so on, disappointed and so on, racism and so on, political structure and so on, I don't tolerate that and so on and so on, plans and so on and so on, ecological catastrophes and so on and so on. Muslims are coming and so on, things and so on, emancipation and so on, swear and so on, economic justice and so on, women's rights and so on and so on, marriages and so on, gays, pride parades and so on. We invented human rights and so on and so on, women's rights and so on and so on, the entire country and so on and so on, Al-Qaeda and so on, minorities and so on, the history of mankind and so on and so on. Let's call it fascism and so on, poor and so on, economic nonsense and so on, issues and so on and so on. The rise of new fascism and so on. Fascism is rising and so on and so on. It is intermingle and so on, ISIS and so on, Islam and so on and so on. Ordinary people and so on, anxieties and so on, all the world and so on and so on. Into the trap of populism and so on and so on, movements and so on and so on, big disorders and so on and so on, racial tensions and so on and so on, okay, and so on and so on, bomb them all and so on.